The security guard put his hand on the man's shoulder before he finished his sentence. Not roughly, not with any particular aggression, just the firm, practiced pressure of someone who had done this before and expected it to be sufficient. It was the kind of touch that said everything was already decided, and the only remaining question was whether the person on the receiving end understood that yet. The man on the receiving end understood a great deal that the security guard did not. His name was Solomon Reed. He was 44 years old, wearing a dark navy jacket over a simple white shirt, dark trousers, leather shoes that were clean and unremarkable. He was holding the hand of his 8-year-old daughter, Nadia, who was wearing a pale green dress and the expression of a child who had been promised something interesting and was still waiting for it to begin. She had her father's cheekbones and her mother's capacity for stillness, and she was currently being very still indeed, watching the security guard's hand on her father's shoulder with the focused attention of someone filing information. The auction house was called Meridian. It occupied 4 floors of a building on the corner of Calloway and 8th, a building that had been purchased 7 years ago by a holding company called Reedstone Properties, and which appeared in the public record under that name, and which Solomon Reed had not once visited in his own name because that was not how he operated and had never been how he operated. He had come tonight because tonight was different. Tonight was the autumn preview, the most significant event in Meridian's calendar. The evening when the major lots for the season's flagship sale were displayed for the first time to invited guests and a small number of walk-in visitors. He had come because Nadia had been asking for 3 weeks to see real art in a real place. Not on a screen, not in a book, but in a room. And because Solomon Reed was a man who took his daughter's questions seriously and tried to answer them with the best possible version of the answer, he had also come. Because he had not been to this building in 14 months, and he believed in seeing things for himself. The evening had started without incident. They had come through the main entrance on Calloway, Solomon, and Nadia, and moved through the ground floor gallery where the preview lots were displayed under careful lighting, and Nadia had walked slowly from piece to piece with the concentrated attention of someone doing something she had decided to take seriously. She had asked questions. Solomon had answered the ones he could and been honest about the ones he couldn't. She had pointed at a large abstract canvas near the east wall and said it looked like a storm, deciding whether to happen, which Solomon had thought was the most accurate description of that particular piece he had ever heard, and he had told her so. They had been in the building for 40 minutes when the incident occurred. It happened at the entrance to the upper gallery, the second-floor space where the highest value lots were displayed and where access was restricted to verified invitees and registered preview guests. Solomon had not registered because the building was his, and he had not thought registration would be necessary. He understood now that this was an error in reasoning, though not the kind of error that should have produced the response it produced. The woman at the second-floor entrance was named Claire. She was in her early 30s, efficiently dressed, holding a tablet with the guest list on it and wearing the expression of someone who considered door management to be a serious professional responsibility. She had looked at Solomon and Nadia as they approached and made her assessment in the span of a single upward glance. "Good evening," she said. "This floor is restricted to preview guests. Do you have your registration confirmation?" Solomon looked at her. "I don't have a confirmation," he said. "We've been downstairs for the past 40 minutes. We came in through the main entrance." Claire's expression remained professional. "I understand," she said, "but the upper gallery requires separate registration. It's a ticketed preview for invited collectors and verified account holders." She paused in a way that was not quite a pause, and more like a door being gently but firmly closed. "I'd be happy to direct you back to the ground floor," Solomon said. "Is there a way to register at the door?" Claire said. The registration window closed 72 hours before the event. "I'm afraid there's no walk-in accommodation for this floor this evening." She said this last part with the smooth finality of someone who had delivered the same sentence many times and had optimized it for the minimum surface area of conversation. Solomon looked at her steadily. He said, "I'd like to speak with your event director." Something moved through Claire's expression. Not quite irritation, not quite discomfort, just the specific recalibration that happened when a person had expected a conversation to be over and found that it wasn't. "Of course," she said. One moment, she spoke into a small earpiece. Then she looked back at Solomon with an expression that had clarified into something slightly more formal. "If you'd like to wait here," she said. Nadia had been standing beside her father, looking at the artwork visible through the open archway of the upper gallery with the focused attention of someone who could see a thing they wanted to look at and was experiencing the specific frustration of not being able to get to it. She looked up at Solomon. "Are those the better ones?" she asked, nodding toward the upper gallery. Solomon looked at the pieces visible through the archway. "Some of them are," he said. Nadia considered this. "Can we see them?" "We're working on it," he said. She returned to looking at them from where she stood. With the patient determination of someone who had decided that if she could not go to the art, she would look at it from here as carefully as she could, the event director arrived 6 minutes later. His name was Harlan, and he was in his mid-50s with the silver-templed authority of a man who had been in the auction world for a long time and had developed strong opinions about most things in it. He moved across the floor with the measured confidence of someone who ran rooms and knew it. And he arrived at the entrance with his conclusion already drawn, which was evident in the way he positioned himself alongside Claire before he had heard a single word from Solomon. "Good evening," Harlan said, with the warmth of a man who was performing warmth while meaning something adjacent to it. "I understand there's been some confusion about floor access." He looked between Solomon and Nadia, and back to Solomon with the expression of someone whose understanding of the situation was complete and whose response to it was both certain and final. "Our upper gallery this evening is restricted to our collector community. It's an exclusive preview for individuals with an established relationship with Meridian. I'm sure you understand. The phrase 'our collector community' landed in the space between them with the specific weight of a phrase designed to include certain people by excluding others without saying so directly." Solomon looked at him. He said, "I have a relationship with this building that predates Meridian's tenancy by several years." Harlan's expression maintained its warmth, but something underneath it had shifted slightly. "I'm not sure I follow," he said. Solomon said, "The building you're operating in is owned by Reedstone Properties." "I'm Solomon Reed." A silence followed this. It was not a long silence, but it was complete. Harlan looked at him. He looked at him the way a man looked at information that was rearranging something he had considered settled. He said, "I'm not familiar with that name in our records." Solomon said, "You wouldn't be. Reedstone holds the property. My name doesn't appear in Meridian's operational records." He paused. "But it appears on the lease agreement you sign every year." Harlan opened his mouth. He closed it. Claire was looking at her tablet with the expression of someone who wished very much that the tablet contained information relevant to the current situation. Harlan said, "I'd need to verify that." Solomon said, "Of course." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a card. It was plain, white, with clean dark lettering. It read Solomon Reed, Principal Reedstone Properties, and below that a phone number and an email address. He placed it on Claire's tablet with the unhurried ease of a man who had made this gesture before and had never needed to make it twice. Harlan looked at the card. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment that stretched past the time required to read 8 words. During this time, the security guard, whose name was Thomas and who had been stationed near the entrance and had been watching the exchange with the alert attention of someone whose job was to be ready to act, moved forward. He had been told by Harlan, before coming downstairs, that there had been a situation at the upper gallery entrance and that he should be available. He had interpreted this briefing as preparation to remove someone, and he was now in the process of acting on that interpretation. He put his hand on Solomon's shoulder. "Sir," Thomas said, "I'm going to need to ask you to come with me." Solomon did not move. He did not flinch. He turned his head very slowly and looked at Thomas's hand on his shoulder with the particular expression of a man who had seen this specific gesture many times in his life and had made a permanent decision about how to respond to it. which was to be completely still and completely clear. He said, "Please remove your hand." His voice was not loud. It was not heated. It was the voice of a man making a statement that contained its own enforcement. Thomas removed his hand. He did this without being told twice, responding to something in Solomon's voice that his professional instincts recognized as a register above the one he had prepared for. Nadia had turned from the artwork. She was looking at her father with the expression of someone who was very carefully deciding how to feel about something while waiting for more information. Solomon looked down at her. He held her gaze for a moment. He said, "It's all right." She looked at the hand that had been on his shoulder and back at his face. She said, "I know," in the tone she used when she was not entirely certain but was choosing to trust him. Harlan was on his phone. He had stepped 2 paces away and was speaking in a low voice to someone with the urgent brevity of a person who needed an answer immediately. He listened for approximately 20 seconds. Then he ended the call and stood very still, for a moment with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who was experiencing the specific sensation of a floor he had considered solid, revealing itself to be something else. He turned to face Solomon. "Mr. Reed," he said. His voice had changed. The managed warmth had gone out of it and been replaced by something more careful and more honest. "I owe you an apology." Solomon waited. Harlan said, "I've just spoken with our legal team. They've confirmed your relationship to this property." He stopped. He looked at Thomas, then at Claire. He looked back at Solomon. "What happened at this entrance tonight should not have happened. What Thomas just did should not have happened. I take full responsibility for the environment that produced both." Solomon looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I appreciate that." Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked at Claire. He did not say anything further to either of them because the moment did not require words from him, and he had never been a man who filled silences unnecessarily. Harlan said, "Please, both floors are open to you this evening. Whatever you and your daughter would like to see." Solomon looked at Nadia. She had been watching the conversation with the absorbed attention of someone who understood most of it and was processing the parts she didn't. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked through the archway into the upper gallery. The upper gallery was everything the ground floor had promised and considerably more. It was a long, high-ceilinged room with pale walls and precise lighting and 23 lots arranged with the specific spatial intelligence of people who understood that how art was seen was inseparable from what was seen. Solomon had approved the renovation of this space 2 years ago. He had stood in the empty room with the architect and talked about light and proportion and the way a person's body moved through space when it felt welcomed rather than managed. He had been precise about what he wanted, and the architect had been excellent, and the result was this room, which worked exactly as they had intended. Nadia walked through it with her hands clasped behind her back, which was what she did when she was looking at something seriously and wanted to be certain she did not accidentally touch it. She moved slowly, stopping in front of each piece for as long as she needed, and Solomon walked beside her, not leading, not directing, simply accompanying. She stopped in front of a large oil painting near the center of the room. It was a figurative piece, a woman seated at a window, painted with the kind of attention to light that made the painted light feel like actual light. Nadia stood in front of it for a long time. Solomon waited. She said, "Who is she?" Solomon looked at the painting. "I don't know," he said. The artist didn't give a title that said. Nadia looked at it for another moment. "I think she's waiting for something," she said, but not in a sad way, in the way where you know it's coming and you're just being patient. Solomon looked at his daughter and then at the painting and thought that she had described it more precisely than the catalog notes had. She moved on. He followed. They spent an hour in the upper gallery. Nadia did not rush. She gave each piece the time she decided it required and moved on when she was satisfied, and she asked questions when she had them and was quiet when she didn't. She was, Solomon thought, exactly the kind of person this room had been built for. The kind who came to look rather than to be seen looking, who brought their full attention and left the room knowing something they hadn't known when they entered. Near the end of the hour, She stopped in front of a small piece near the far wall. It was modest in scale compared to the others. A charcoal drawing on pale paper, a study of hands. Two hands, one larger and one smaller, not quite touching. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Solomon's hand in hers, and then at the drawing again. She said, "That's us." Solomon looked at the drawing. He looked at his daughter's hand in his. He said, "I think you're right." She looked at it for another moment. She said, "Can we get it?" Solomon thought about the estimate he had seen in the catalog notes. He thought about the conversation he was going to have with Harlan before they left. He thought about Nadia standing in front of this drawing in this room, that he had spent 2 years and a significant amount of money renovating because he believed that rooms where people came to look at things should be rooms that were worthy of looking at. He said, "We'll see," which was, in Solomon Reed's vocabulary, as close to yes as he ever said before a thing was confirmed. Nadia looked at the drawing one more time. Then she nodded, with the gravity of someone who had asked a real question and received a real answer, and they moved on. Harlan found them near the staircase at the end of the evening. He had been present in the room for the past 40 minutes, managing the event with the professional attention his role required. But he had not approached Solomon, giving him and Nadia the space of the room without interference. This was the correct call, and Solomon had noticed it. "Mr. Reed," Harlan said. He had the posture of a man who had been thinking carefully about what he wanted to say and had arrived at the conclusion that direct was better than managed. "May I have a few minutes?" Solomon looked at Nadia. She had her catalog open and was looking at the image of the charcoal drawing with the focused attention of someone who had not finished thinking about something. He said, "Nadia, I'm going to speak with this gentleman for a moment." She waved a hand without looking up, which meant she had heard him and he could proceed. They stood near the window at the top of the staircase. Through the glass, the street below was busy with the ordinary movement of a Thursday evening. People going in directions they had chosen. The city continuing its business with the complete indifference to individual events that Solomon had always found more steadying than troubling. Harlan said, "I want to speak plainly, if that's all right," Solomon said. "I'd prefer it," Harlan said. "What happened at the entrance tonight was a failure of judgment. Mine as much as anyone's. I briefed Thomas before the event that there had been a situation, and I used language that implied the situation was a security concern rather than a policy question. That framing directed his response. The hand on your shoulder was a consequence of how I set up the situation, not just of his individual decision." Solomon looked at him. He said, "That's an honest account." Harlan said, "I've been in this business for 22 years. I've operated in spaces like this my entire career, and I know what assumptions drive decisions in these spaces. I know what they look like, and I've seen what they cost people. Tonight I let them operate in my event without examining them." He paused. "I'm not asking you to find that acceptable. I'm telling you I know what it was." Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you intend to do with that knowledge?" Harlan said, "Whatever you think is warranted." He said it without qualification. Solomon looked out the window at the street below. He thought about the answer to that question in the way he thought about consequential answers, not quickly and not with the first thing that arrived. He said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." Harlan said, "Yes." Solomon said, "If I had walked in tonight in a different jacket, would this evening have been different?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. That was the length of an honest answer being assembled rather than a diplomatic one. He said yes, probably from the first floor, which is a different problem than tonight's problem and a larger one. Solomon nodded. He looked at Harlan. He said, "I'd like you to stay on as event director." Harlan looked at him. That was not what he had expected. Solomon said, "Not because tonight was acceptable. Because the answer you just gave me was..." He paused. "I need people running the operations in this building who can see the problem clearly enough to name it. You just named it. That's where it starts." Harlan said, "I won't give you reason to regret that decision." Solomon said, "I'm not expecting regret. I'm expecting the work." He turned and walked back to Nadia, who had completed her catalog review and was now ready, by the look of her, to tell him her conclusions. She delivered them with the directness she brought to most things. She had decided there were 4 pieces she liked best, ranked in order, and she listed them with the calm specificity of someone who had done the work and arrived at a position. The charcoal drawing was first. Solomon listened to all 4 and asked one question about each, and she answered them with the seriousness they deserved. Then he said, "Ready to go?" She said, "Did we get the drawing?" He said, "We're going to." She looked at him. She said, "Is that a yes or a we'll see?" He said, "It's a yes." She said, "Okay," with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly read the distinction and was pleased to have it confirmed, and she took his hand and they walked down the staircase together, through the ground floor gallery where the remaining preview guests were beginning to leave, and out through the main entrance onto Calloway Street. The night air was cool and sharp. Nadia walked beside him with the purposeful stride of a child who was still thinking about what she had seen and was going to be thinking about it for several days. After half a block, she said, "That security man put his hand on you." "Yes," Solomon said. She thought about this. "You didn't get loud," she said. "No," he said. She walked for a moment. Why not? Solomon thought about how to answer that in a way that was true and also something she could use. He said, "Because getting loud would have made it about the moment, and I was thinking about something longer than the moment." Nadia considered this with the thoroughness she brought to things worth considering. Then she said, "The building?" Solomon looked at his daughter. "More than the building," he said. "But yes, partly," she nodded. She had filed it. They walked the rest of the block in comfortable silence. The car was at the corner. Solomon opened the door for her and she climbed in and buckled her seatbelt with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been told many times not to wait to be reminded. He got in on the other side and started the engine and pulled into the stream of Thursday night traffic. After a few minutes, Nadia said, "From the back seat, I want to be someone who builds things." Solomon looked at her in the rearview mirror. The passing streetlights moved across her face in the specific rhythm of city driving at night. She was looking out the window with the expression she wore when she was thinking something she had not yet said. "What kind of things?" he asked. She thought about it. "Rooms," she said, "where people can go to look at things properly." Solomon drove. He thought about the empty room and the architect and the conversation about light and proportion and the way a body moved through space when it felt welcomed. He thought about his own father, who had been a draftsman for 30 years and had drawn the plans for other people's buildings his entire career, and who had told Solomon once, sitting at the drafting table in the corner of the living room where he always sat, that the best thing about drawing a building was knowing that somewhere at the end of the lines was a room where someone was going to stand and feel something they hadn't expected to feel. He thought about Nadia standing in front of the charcoal drawing. 2 hands, one larger and one smaller, not quite touching. He said, "Then that's what you'll build." She looked at him in the rearview mirror with the expression that meant she was deciding whether something was real or a thing adults said. She must have decided it was real because she turned back to the window and said nothing further, which was what she did when something had settled. They drove through the city, and the city moved around them, indifferent and continuous and full of buildings that belonged to someone, and Solomon Reed drove his daughter home through streets that did not know his name, past buildings that did not display it, in the unremarkable quiet of a Thursday evening that would not appear in any record anywhere, except in the memory of an 8-year-old girl who had stood in a room and looked at art until she understood it and had decided, somewhere between the storm painting and the charcoal hands, what she was going to do with her life. Some people built things and put their names on them. Some people built things and put the thing itself forward and let the name live in the paperwork and the ledger and the lease, agreements that renewed every year without ceremony. Solomon Reed had built the second kind of thing. Not from modesty and not from strategy, but from the understanding, arrived at early and never revised, that the work was the point, and the work did not need him to stand in front of it to be real. The room was real. The light was real. The drawing of 2 hands was going to hang on a wall in his daughter's room by the end of the week, and she was going to look at it every day, and one day she was going to build a room of her own, where someone else's daughter would stand and look at something until she understood it. That was the whole length of the thing. That was all it had ever needed to be. He thought about the phone call he would make tomorrow morning. Not to a lawyer and not to a board, but to the architect who had designed the upper gallery space, a woman named Iris, who had been his collaborator on 4 projects over the past decade, and who had a particular gift for understanding what he was trying to build before he had found the words for it. He was going to call her because he had been thinking for some time about a 5th project, something smaller than the others and more specific. A dedicated space for emerging artists in a neighborhood that did not yet have one. A space where the walls were hung with work by people who had not yet arrived at the point, where auction houses called them and where the lighting was designed to make the work feel important before the market had decided whether it was. A space where the door was open in the way that this evening's door had not been, where no one stood at an entrance with a tablet and a list. He had the building in mind,